Good afternoon, welcome again to St Chad's Rectory. And yesterday I shared some thoughts about creating a rule of life, and I thought it might be of some interest if I spend the next few of these little sessions just talking a little bit more about a rule of life. A theologian called David Ford wrote a little book called The Shape of Living, and he posed this question. He said, a helpful exercise is to ask ourselves what our main life-shaping desires are. What do we most want to do and be? What are the priorities we feel most deeply about? And in a sense, a rule of life is simply a perspective, a way that helps us answer those questions. What do we most want to do? Who do we most want to be? What are our priorities? And framed in those terms, it's a universal question. Although the notion of a rule of life comes deeply out of the spiritual traditions of the world, in the West, the notion of a rule can be traced back to at least the rule of Saint Benedict, writing 1500 years ago, setting up communities of Christian prayer and practice as the Roman Empire was disintegrating. Benedict wrote a simple rule, a little rule as he called it, to help regulate the life of monks in a community, living close together, living in enclosure, perhaps as a way of regulating their interactions. So the faith root is pretty deep, but it's also universal, because many people in life find a rule of life a helpful discipline, whether they are people of faith, whether they are Christians or not. Because the Latin root of the word is derived from the word regular, which simply means rhythm, regularity of pattern, a recognisable standard for the conduct of life. A spiritual writer called Esther Duvall points out that regular is a feminine noun, which carries gentle connotations rather than the harsh negatives we often associate with the phrase rules and regulations. Yes, a rule is about an orderly way of existence, but we embrace it as a way of life, not as a keeping of a set of rules for their own sake. And the word for rule has a kind of double root meaning. One is that of a signpost, which has a purpose of pointing away from itself, so as to inform the traveller they're going in the right direction on their journey. It would be pretty foolish to claim you're going in the right direction if you stop at the signpost. The rule is a signpost. It helps point the way beyond itself. But the other root meaning is that of, if you imagine a staircase with a banister, as a kind of banister railing, something that gives support as you move forward, as you climb or descend on your journey. It's a signpost, it points beyond itself. It's also a banister railing, because we all need support. We all need that affirmation on the journey. And so I'm suggesting that for everybody, a rule of life can be a helpful way forward. If you're a Christian, then your rule of life will include a fairly frank acknowledgement of the search for God, of the need to be open to God's guidance, because it's a kind of framework that helps on that journey. If you're not yet a person of faith, it can still be helpful to evaluate, to think about your priorities, to think about what energizes you, and to go on that journey. But of course, just having a rule in itself doesn't achieve anything without the wider lifestyle. Here's a story. One day a disciple came to his master and asked, "Master, what can I do to become enlightened?" The master replied, "As much as you can do to make the sun shine." Confused, the disciple replied, "Then of what use are all these disciplines?" The master said, "So that when the sun begins to rise, you do not miss it." when the sun begins to rise, you do not miss it. We often go through life a little bit blind, a bit distracted. A rule of life helps sharpen our perception, that we notice, that we contemplate, that we see, that we recognise the good around us. And, pray God, that we recognise the divine presence. As I suggested earlier, you don't have to necessarily fill a rule of life with an enormous number of religious obligations. My first mistake many years ago, when I first wrote a rule of life, was that it was rather macho. It contained things that were quite challenging. It wasn't deliverable. It didn't work. Winston Churchill had a rule of life, and he said this: "My rule of life, prescribed as an absolutely sacred right, smoking cigars and also the drinking of alcohol before, after, and if need be, during all meals and in the intervals between them." I'm not necessarily commending that to you today, but it illustrates the fact that many people in history have adopted their own rule. And a good place to start is simply by going back to that question of David Ford's. What do we want? Particularly in a time of constraint, of limitation, what really matters? How are we going to set our priorities? And as we set those priorities, how are we going to keep ourselves accountable and on track? Because if you're a person of faith setting up a rule of life, you can seek the grace of God. In fact, you can seek the grace of God whether you have faith or not. You can ask for help in fulfilling what is in your rule of life. It needs to be gentle, but it needs to also have some shape. As David Ford says, it's about the shape of living. Our shapes at the moment are being knocked about, squeezed, pressed. We're not going to look the same at the end of this as we did at the beginning. But maybe a rule of life will help us not so much control the process as to be alert to when the sun begins to rise, because rise it will. And then we can celebrate. Because the rule of life takes us deep into the question why. Here's another quote to finish with. A rule of life is not just about how you live your life, it is about why you live your life. May we in these days think more deeply, reflect more profoundly, seek out the wisdom that is granted to us, and live by it. And may you know the peace and goodness of the divine presence who journeys with you.